Apparently that's the security announcement done, so you now know where to flee if either the fire starts or you get bored. Welcome everyone, my name's Torsten Bell, I'm the director of the Resolution Foundation, and you're all very welcome here today. Before we even start, it's only 9 AM and everyone deserves a pay rise because you somehow found the room. It took me about 3 goes on the way up. This is a proper labyrinth, so well done. Now we're here to talk about pay. For 3 hours or so, and it can be a bit depressing, and we were worried about all of your kind of mental health. So that is why we've timed this to be immediately after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, because the only thing more depressing than your pay packets is the end of the world. So hopefully that's got you in the right place. So this will be up curve now, basically. Now, what we're going to do today is I'm going to just kick off with a short presentation summarising a report that we've published today on Britain's pay crisis. Then we're going to have 2 panels digging into the detail of what's going on in the UK. I'm not going to introduce the panels because they're going to introduce themselves shortly. Then you're allowed a coffee break. And then afterwards we're going to have a little bit of perk us up time by reminding us that the US and some other countries also have a pay crisis and digging into what's going on there before we finish with a session on what on earth does slow pay growth mean for our politics and for our political economy in the years ahead, i.e. kind of where do we go from here. So that is the plan. But to kick us off, I'm going to just take you through the headlines from the report that we've published today. The first thing to start with is big picture. It's a disaster. Now, you kind of already knew this, but it is always just worth reminding us how much we didn't think this either could happen or how bad it would be if it did. So this is showing you pay growth over a number of decades. For the purposes of this chart, decades start with a 9. That's because we haven't got 2020 yet. But you can see we're used to growth around high 2s or 3% in the kind of boom bit of capitalism, the glory days of capitalism in Britain, 45 to 75. The tough bit, 80s and 90s, we still had growth of over 2%. This decade, we've managed to make it fall by minus 0.2%. Well done, everyone. That is quite an achievement. None of us thought that was possible. Turns out if you work really hard at it, it is. So the question is, why has that happened? Why has what we thought couldn't happen happened over the last 10 years? And one of the things we want to say in this report is there are 2 different questions that you need to answer when thinking about that. So this is just showing you pay growth over the last 20 years, showing you the pre-crisis period in blue, ticking along, as I said before, at around 2%, and then the sharp downturn that happens as the financial crisis hits, which sees pay actually fall, and fall quite fast from 2008 through to 2011, bump along till about 2014. So the first thing is this big downturn happens, pay falls fast. So the question with that is, why did the UK see such a big fall in pay? Yeah? Now, lots of countries saw some fall in pay, but we were the winners. Unless you completely tanked your economy, you didn't manage to get anywhere near the pay squeeze we had. Other big advanced economies didn't, and so why were we so unusual in that happening? Then the second question, which is related but is not the same question, is why has since then the pay recovery been so slow? And in particular, why has our pay recovery been so slow given that other economic variables, in particular unemployment, has been so strong? You get it in red because it's a big question. So there's 2 questions. Why is our pay squeeze so much worse, initial pay fall so much worse than the other countries? And 2, why has pay growth not got back to pre-crisis levels even now, despite unemployment being much lower than it was pre-crisis? Yeah? Those are the 2 questions I want to briefly touch on in the presentation. So the first thing, why were we so much worse than the rest of the world to start with? Here's the depressing chart, but I do think it is worth reminding ourselves. I often we just think, oh, everyone had a big pay squeeze. This is just what happened in the financial crisis. That is not true. So this is showing you pay falls between 2010 and 2014 across a selection of similar-ish countries. And the basic, just to keep this simple, let's just focus on 2 countries that had similar size recessions. So let's just focus on Germany and the US. Both had pay falls between 2 and 3%. Our pay fall was twice as big. It's not a little bit bigger, it's more than twice as large as their pay falls in the immediate post-crisis period. So that is the question we are trying to answer. Now, the key is, a lot of this is just because we got, this was a huge crisis. Yeah, much bigger than we thought when it started in 2008, and it's lasted much longer. So obviously, part of the answer here is don't really tank your economy. It's really bad for pay, but you knew that one. So we're going to try and answer beyond that, what might we want to learn about what is going on. So the first thing is, if anyone remembers back to 2008, in fact, Larry probably wrote this article. It's not your fault, though. Okay, so when the pay squeeze started, yeah, and when the crisis started, we were all writing these pieces, some of us internally in government, some of us externally, saying unemployment's going to head back up towards 3 million. It's such a deep recession. We're going to be back to where we were in the 80s and 90s. That's what we thought would happen. We were very wrong. Unemployment did not pick up in the way we were expecting at all. And the first goes at saying, why is unemployment not shooting up as fast as we thought? It's because people said, well, what's happening is mature workers and a flexible labour market are leading to workers accepting voluntarily pay cuts. That's what we said. Lots of people said that. There were lots of very exciting work. And do you ever remember Honda? I'm now stretching everyone's memories. There were lots of articles, you definitely wrote this one, saying Honda's workers have agreed to cut their hours and cut their pay so no one loses their job. Larry's is not agreeing that he wrote this. Right. Anyway, so that was crap. Yeah. We all said that was true. People went on about it for a year. It broadly was not true. There was no rise in people accepting nominal, as in cash pay cuts, earning less per hour. So the people earning less per hour is the blue bar. It did go up. It went up in the beginning of the 90s. That's when inflation stopped being high, largely. But really what we saw increase in this crisis is more people got no pay rise. Yeah? So nominal rigidities, which is what we used to think causes unemployment in crises, were exactly the same in this crisis. They were not. It wasn't suddenly, oh, there's no trade unions and there's no worker bargaining power and they're already mature now, so everyone takes a pay cut. Actually, exactly what the textbook said should happen on pay is what happened. We had a big uptick in the number of people getting their pay frozen at zero, but we did not have an uptick, really, in the number of people actually taking cash pay cuts. Yeah? So that hypothesis, and if they had cash pay cuts, then that might have explained why unemployment wasn't shooting up. But it doesn't, because it never happened. We just didn't notice till 5 years later. Then some people said, well, maybe it's because inequality is rising again and the pay of the middle is getting really badly trashed, but the rich are protecting themselves by others. And this is just to make this is showing you the pay squeeze across the entire income distribution. Lower earners on the left, higher earners on the right. They all basically had between an 8 and a 10% pay squeeze. So when George Osborne said we're all in it together, on the pay squeeze bit, he was totally spot on. Everyone got stuffed. In fact, if we included this, if you could measure really rich people's earnings, because they weren't all self-employed and other things, then they got absolutely hammered initially. It wasn't a good time to be a banker. It's okay now, but you didn't want to be a banker in the middle of the crisis. So it's nothing to do with inequality. Yeah, the pay squeeze is nothing to do with it. It doesn't mean inequality is not really high, but this pay squeeze is not caused by inequality rising. What is it caused by? And in what do we, in retrospect, did we miss the importance of? Is that in the crisis, sterling absolutely nosedived. Yeah? We had a huge banking sector. People looked at Britain and thought, that does not look great. And so sterling went through the floor. It's more than it. The 27% fall we're referencing there, which is on its own bigger than the ERM fall, which everybody thinks of as a devaluation crisis in the 1990s. This crisis, which nobody thought of as a devaluation crisis, had a much bigger sterling fall, and that is just the sterling fall in the immediate crisis phase. Actually, the peak to trough is nearer, I think it must be nearly 40%. So a huge devaluation in sterling. Yeah. Now, the question is, how do I get from a huge devaluation of sterling to explaining big pay falls? And the answer is because sterling dropping pushed up inflation because imported goods were more expensive suddenly, yeah, and gave us much higher inflation over that period. This is cumulative inflation on consumer prices, people paying in the shops, much higher inflation than we saw in Germany or the United States over this period. And that is the dominant reason why. So when we say pay falls were bigger in the UK, it is less to do with particularly weak nominal pay, cash pay, and much more to do with what your pay could buy in the shops shrunk a lot faster in the UK than elsewhere because of higher inflation. So that is our first lesson. Now, so that you may conclude from that, well, we shouldn't have these pay falls. It's not very nice. We'd like to be able to buy goods. But our caveat to that is, had we, and that's possible. So this chart is showing you a simple model to say what do we think would have happened to the pay squeeze if we had had the same inflation as everybody else. So if we'd had average inflation rather than well above inflation, what would have happened to the pay squeeze? And our answer is it would have, instead of being 7% and double most other countries, it would have been basically middle of the pack. We'd have had the same pay squeeze as everybody else, more or less. So you might be like, well, that's great. Why can't we just have that? That would have been a triumph. And our answer to that is, had that happened in a slightly complicated way, we estimate you'd have had 800,000 more people unemployed. Now, this is not like you don't want to have to choose between these things, but all else equal, I would prefer have that in a crisis, not after a crisis, but in a crisis, I prefer have that than that. Because a huge unemployment is a small number of people relatively bearing all the pain of an economic crisis and all the pain of an adjustment, whereas a pay squeeze that affects everybody is rubbish, has had a much bigger political effect in the long term. I mean, it's really interesting. A pay squeeze changes politics, as we'll come on to later, a lot more than 3 million unemployment did in the 1980s. That was when David Willits, who's over there, was still winning elections, despite there being 3 million unemployed. Turns out the Tory party can't win elections after an 8% pay squeeze. So this matters about who suffers economic pain. Right, that's why we think Britain's pay squeeze was so big. Now we get on to what on earth has happened since. Why has the pay recovery been so weak since? Right, just to remind you what is going on. So pre-crisis, real earnings, weekly earnings, are growing at around 2 and a bit, just over 2% a year, fairly consistently, slightly slowing down in the 2000s, but broadly ticking along. In the recovery phase, which by recovery I'm talking 2014 to 2017, we've been around 0.7% real earnings. So they are 1.5% lower. And that puzzle, why are earnings 1.5% growing at 1.5% more slowly than they were pre-crisis, despite unemployment being below where it was pre-crisis? We're now at 4% unemployment. Pre-crisis, the average is roughly 5%. So we're quite a lot further below. So that is our second question that we're trying to answer. This is just to remind you. This is to remind you the same thing, which is across this whole period since 2014, the average of unemployment is 5%. We're now at 4%, and that's the same as the unemployment pre-crisis. So why, given that we've got back to pre-crisis unemployment, have we not got back to pre-crisis wage growth? Is the question we're answering. Now, some people say, well. And people said this in kind of 2013, 14. What's going on here is that the Phillips curve has disappeared. The relationship between unemployment and pay has just gone. And the reason it's gone is because workers have lost all their bargaining power. There is no Phillips curve anymore. We've got a really serious problem going on. And you still get versions of that, with people sometimes doing work today saying, we've run this numbers and we can't find any evidence of a Phillips curve since the financial crisis in Britain. To which the answer is either look harder, or as I'll come on to, as we do in the paper, or of course it doesn't appear in the overall numbers because nobody's had a pay rise in a decade, so you're not going to find it if you look in the data right now across the whole country. Yeah? But this is just to show you, so we think the Phillips curve is there. We go into this in painful detail in the report. I recommend skipping that 2 pages of the report. But believe me, looking across regions of the country, we can find evidence of a Phillips curve. But the key thing is that how we think about slack tightness in our labour market is not just about unemployment. Is what we find. It is instead about unemployment, yes, which has recovered to pre-crisis lows, but is about 2 other things as well. Underemployment, so this is the Danny Blanchflower, David Bell stuff, where people want more hours. Yeah, they want more hours. We tweak their work and say, let's focus on the people that want more hours and are actually trying to get them. Yeah, they're the ones that look more like labour market slack in the traditional textbook fashion. This is showing you that group. So this is showing you over the last 20 years who wants more hours than they're currently doing and is actively trying to get them. And when we say, this is what we mean by there's some slack left in the labour market. So that we've currently got about 700,000 people who want more hours and actively looking. We had about 500,000 before the crisis, but as you can see, we had a lot in the crisis, a lot. So it was when I said to you earlier, unemployment didn't surge. Well, that is true, but that doesn't mean the labour market slack wasn't built up. It was built up in other forms. And it was also built up in people who were doing insecure work and want to move into the more mainstream labour market. And that is a key part of why we think wages were weak during the last 4 years, because people were increasing their hours or moving into more secure work. Yeah? So like 0 hours contracts, self-employment you don't want, agency work, these things have all started to plateau or fall because they are measures of slack to some degree. Now, we think this explains about a fifth of that slower pay growth than we would otherwise have expected 2014 to 2017. But the key thing is that on these measures, there's basically no slack left now. So we don't think it can be explaining what's going on right now, because although this is still slightly elevated over pre-crisis levels, unemployment is much lower, 5% down to 4%. So any kind of holistic view of slack in the labour market leads us to conclude there is not a lot of slack left right now. There's some, but it's really hard to look at these numbers and unemployment and think there's a lot more slack now than there was pre-crisis. There's like bits of this slack left, and there's less unemployment slack than there was before. Right, then some other explanations, and we're not going to go into this in detail, for why pay might be slow today, because obviously if we're now running out of slack, it can't be that slack is the defining feature that's driving slow pay growth right now. So the question is, what else? Now, there's lots of stuff out there saying it's because, and particularly in the US, as we'll come to later, people say, well, there's fundamental changes in our labour market. Big firms have got more powerful. They're not paying people the same. They're able to suppress wages. Without going into lots of detail, our basic view is it's really hard to conclude from the data that there has been fundamental change. For example, that either unions have got much weaker since the financial crisis. They were pretty weak before. They're pretty weak afterwards. That firms have got more dominant. This is showing you, for example, the percentage of workers that work for the biggest firms across our economy. It's not a lot is happening over the whole period, and if anything, it's falling slightly more recently. This is what, when people talk about monopsony, this is national level monopsony. Now, I'm not saying this isn't important. The level can be too high. The level of union weakness can be too high. It can explain inequality. It can explain lots of things. But it's really hard to look at the data and think that these bargaining power explanations can explain weak pay growth now compared to immediately pre-crisis. There's just not enough change in the numbers to explain the size of the pay shift. Something that definitely is going on is that we've got a weaker compositional push to pay. So one of the reasons pay growth goes up is over time we educate people more, hopefully, and they move into better jobs. Overall, the labour force is better educated and doing better jobs. That's broadly what this is showing you. It's showing you in each year how much upward pressure on pay are we getting from, in simple terms, better qualified workforce and people doing higher paid occupations, what we call compositional shifts. I only really want to highlight one thing, which is the average was higher before the crisis, 0.7%. We're now around 0.3. So this is not to do with anything complicated going on. We're just doing a less good job at bringing more people with higher qualifications into the labour force. You can see that because there's all of the boom of HE growth has largely passed through the system now. We've stopped increasing the numbers, and you may have noticed we're not doing anything remotely decent to then increase the numbers of better qualified non-university routes. So the combination of the two means our human capital is not increasing as fast as it once was. And then secondly, there is some slowdown in the occupational, this orange bar, occupational boost. So in general, as our economy grows, there are more people doing higher paid jobs. That has slowed somewhat since the crisis, although it's complicated. But basically, big picture, definitely some of our pay weakness recently is because our labour force is slightly less swiftly improving its occupations and slightly less swiftly improving the occupations it does, and that is going on, and that, all else equal, will last. That qualifications thing is going to carry on. So that's a real problem. That is not like cyclical. The slack will go away. This won't go away unless policy changes. And then we get to the big thing, which is some people there's a tendency around at the moment for people to say, the real problem is that wages have been disconnected from the GDP growth of the economy. Yeah, I hear that quite a lot at the moment. Okay, that is a really dangerous thought. Now, it's technically true in a complicated sense when that sterling thing I showed you earlier happened, where you get like GDP changing in a way that's different to consumer prices. So as I'll show you in a second later, you do get something like that going on. But that does not mean that higher GDP does not lead to higher wages, all else equal. It just means you should avoid a large devaluation by becoming poorer if you possibly can. So this is showing you output per hour in the UK, pre-crisis 2.2% growth, post-crisis 0.4%. Like, it has been a catastrophe, and that is very tightly tied to what's happened to wages. This is showing you wages over exactly the same time period, showing you that they quite closely match to productivity. Yeah. Now, the thing I said to you before about, like, this is the devaluation happening. So GDP, productivity, and wages do not tightly match when consumer prices are going up because of import inflation, but output prices are not for goods. So this is showing you like what we produce, and this is showing you what we consume in price terms. Yeah? And when inflation is driven by import prices, we end up with a divergence between the two. But that does not mean they're disconnected. It just means in that phase, a price effect is going on. It's a real one. Yeah? But it doesn't mean that it's disconnected going forward. And it means we should definitely not start saying it doesn't matter for the average worker what our GDP growth is. The reason why the average worker is not getting a decent pay rise is because our productivity is a complete turkey. Yeah? And that is our overall thing. My overall message is to explain weak pay growth recently, you don't need conspiracy theories, you don't need kind of very complicated answers. You need some productivity growth, and we need to recognise that we're at the back end of a huge economic cycle with huge slack in our labour market, which is only now being worn through. So conclusions. In the downturn, a lesson that we all missed in 2008, unless someone wants to put their hand up and say they spotted it, but broadly, no one in government at any stage talked about the exchange rate except in a kind of crisis mode a few times, or about what it would do to pay. We completely missed it. It really matters, and it matters what your recession looks like. If your exchange rate can adjust to a big crisis, you will get pay falls and less unemployment. But my second point is don't assume that will always happen. The danger is we now will assume, we fix this labour market problem, we will never get high unemployment in a recession again, don't worry, we can shut down Job Centre Plus and stuff, yeah? Well, it's perfectly feasible you get a recession where the exchange rate cannot adjust. For example, where us and other countries are affected equally, rather than us being particularly badly hit. The exchange rate could easily not adjust, and you could easily get an unemployment surge again. And if that happens, we better be sure that our policy can adjust quickly to meet that challenge. Today, our view is we should not keep thinking about weak pay today as a puzzle. The heightened slack that we had over the last 5 years that wasn't visible in the unemployment figures helps to explain quite a large chunk of why pay growth was so weak. We've also then got a longer term trend of slower occupational upgrading and educational upgrading, and those are going to be ongoing problems, particularly on the educational side, unless we do something. And lastly, today, weak productivity growth is the problem. That's what drove the last 10 years being disastrous. It's what's driving weak pay growth today. And if pay growth takes off tomorrow, it will be because productivity growth has picked up. Thank you very much. That's what the report says. Obviously, you're all going to read however many pages Stephen has written. I don't know, quite a lot. He's not got a lot. He likes words. But obviously, it does a better job than I've managed of explaining what we're saying. So that's what we think. Now, what we're going to do now is do two